Hello and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1957 film The Mysterians, which was made in Japan by the company Toho, directed by Ishiro Honda with special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya. All those names should be familiar to you if you listen to the Godzilla episode or are familiar with Godzilla. Before I get into the show, I wanted to quickly mention this will be the last video for the podcast if you are watching on YouTube or on the website for at least a few months, as I am extremely busy and also have quite a few plans for the podcast that I want to put into practice, but I never seem to have time to do so. I will also give you some more information about the podcast and what's going to be happening at the end of the episode. A little more context on the Mysterians and 1957. The year prior, in 1956, the big film Rodan was released in Japan, and in the USA in 1956, Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the USA edit of the original Godzilla, was also released. Now on to my wonderful guests. First up, Jay Talott is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He has written/edited lots and lots of essays, articles and books on science fiction, including the 2023 book, Selling Science Fiction Cinema. Welcome back to the show, Jay. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
Great. Joining Jay is Yuki Miyamoto. He is Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Humanities Center at DePaul University. Her work focuses on the ethics around nuclear discourse. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for having me again.
Great. I want to start off to talk a little bit about the golden age of cinema in Japan. So, Jay, can I go to you to put that into a little bit of context, both in Japan and in relation to the USA?
Well, certainly Japan is for the period we're talking about, and that is, let's say, the 1950s, early 1960s, with the Mysterians appearing right there in the center of that period, 1957, and then 1959 when it is released in the United States. This is a period of enormous ferment and development, and basically an outburst of creativity, particularly following the end of censorship. With the end of World War II, Japan is under an occupation that is trying to push certain Western ideals. And that includes, therefore, a censorship unit. I think it was called the CIE.
Yeah, which is the Civil Information and Education section.
Yes, the Civil Information and Education section. And they take it upon themselves to sign off on all film. And that has some good impact, and that is pushing Japanese filmmakers to look outward and to take on ideas that were not necessarily central to the culture previously. But it also has this deadening impact in that it tries to erase a good bit of Japanese history. And so when that goes away in 1952, we suddenly have an explosion of really world-class and interesting films, such as the great output of Kurosawa, films that are, but also films that take on women's role issues in the 1950s. That was something very new. But then also the kaiju, monster, and ultimately science fiction films. And these are films that are also going to make an international splash. Some of them are going to win major awards at international film festivals, and others are going to make a lot of money. And I think this is one of the interesting things. I've written about this. The Japanese film industry is very proud of these award-winning films that they see as certainly on a par with the best films made in any other culture in the 1950s. And at the same time, you find them apologizing, strangely enough, for these films that make money. The films that are not making money are those award-winning films. And they go in quite a push to try to attract more attention to the award-winning films, and including establishing of a Japanese Film Week at Museum of Modern Art in New York. And they do this for a number of years in a row. 57, which is the year they first make Mysterians. Japanese Film Week is accompanied by a delegation from the Japanese Motion Picture Producers Association, and they try very hard to publicize what they see as their greatest films. And then they also apologize for these terrible monster films that are coming to the U.S. and elsewhere. At the same time, we have the marketing representative from Toho, which makes so many of the kaiju films, coming in and saying, we want to offer you more of these films. We know what you like. We know what the world likes. The world is interested in science fiction. We're not going to get away from science fiction. We have to embrace it. And they announce a whole set of new films that are soon to be forthcoming. And they announce it because, in very flashy fashion, because they know that the various major American studios and distributors are looking for product. And they've recognized something like Godzilla, when it's reworked a bit and offered in the American market, makes an enormous amount of money for a minimal investment. So I think this is the context we need to keep in mind with the Mysterians. I guess the other thing to note about this sort of general background is the Mysterians is the great beneficiary of the other films that Toho has made. That is, it becomes the most expensive. I don't know if it's the most expensive kaiju or science fiction film made in Japan to that point, but it's the most expensive in terms of American purchase rights. MGM winds up spending $250,000 for this film. Godzilla was acquired for $25,000.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to just mention slightly, because you talk about delegations going, and I read this article from The Atlantic, which is from 1957, and it talks about how travel became more common in Japan, and it was kind of like considered to be quite a kind of, it was aspirational to travel somewhere and then bring something back and kind of show that you have achieved something by traveling. Can you talk a bit about that kind of culture, Yuki? Is that something that was kind of new around then?
Yeah, traveling was still limited to certain, there are always restrictions during those times. But I appreciate Jay giving us the background and put this film in a bigger context, because in the 50s, and especially I was fascinated by hearing Jay talking about the commercial success, especially in the United States, because those films in the 50s have always this pro and anti-American sentiments and some kind of ambiguities. And you saw that in Godzilla, right? And the same in Mysterians. I think one of the themes is this pacifism, right? And in the 50s, I'm giving a background, a political background, because until 1952, Japan was under the occupation of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, which is basically American military, right? American occupation. And some people think that Japan's peace constitution, Article 9, that Japan should abolish all the means to wage war, which was kind of imposition of the United States. But I have to say that people who had been exhausted by long-standing war at the time of 1945, and most of the lands was obliterated, they embraced that constitution. So when the Korean War broke out in 1950, the United States, or the Allied powers, was the one who actually ordered Japan to set up this Japan Police Reserve Corps, which is a kind of a semi-military, right? And then which actually became the self-defense force to present day. So 1950, this was set up, and throughout there is some kind of conflict or tag of war between pacifists and some people who want to remilitarize Japan. And I think that kind of tension was expressed in these films coming out of Toho.
Mm. And so the Japanese title, which I didn't mention actually, is Earth Defense Force. So I think that puts that into a better context. Yeah, can you tell a bit? Because when I look at the history of Japan around this time, it does, I think, like you've both touched upon, it really has so many kind of opposing forces, and the end of, imperial Japan, and then you've had this huge tragedy, and you've got occupying forces. But in 1957, there's a huge economic boom as well. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of things were happening in Japan that were like the backdrop of all of this kind of cinema that was being created?
Ironically, the economic boom in the 50s in Japan came from the Korean War. So the steel demand was high, and all those demands from the US troops really helped the Japanese economy's recovery from the war. So that was very ironic. And as you know, 1953, Eisenhower made this announcement at the UN conference assembly, Atoms for Peace. So that's the kind of epoch-making announcement in terms of nuclear history. In other words, he is clearly making distinctions between weapons and nuclear power, which also divides people like, oh, weapon is bad, but energy is okay, or all things nuclear is bad, So there's some divisions and ambiguities there. And at the same time, so the US and the Japanese government was promoting this nuclear power, so-called peaceful use of nuclear power. But then Bikini incident took place, which, as we know, that the basis of Godzilla plot, right? And then 1955, 1956, this U.S. Speaking of U.S. aid, the recently dismantled the U.S. aid, which is not quite U.S. aid back then, but the similar branch of the government was helping to set up this exhibition of Atoms for Peace in Japan, throughout Japan. And especially they are targeting on Hiroshima, because Hiroshima is the place where experience.
The bomb, yeah.
So it has to be them who support the nuclear energy. So those are things happening. So pro America, who some people are pro Americans that this is the way, but others were, of course, against Americans, against the nuclear powers, against the remilitarization, kind of seeking a way what it means to be a pacifist country, right? And the pacifist is one of the themes in the Mysterians. So that's the kind of backdrop that I could offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because so you've got the treaty with the US and the Allied forces, and then they've got a recent treaty with the Soviet Union, and then they've also been admitted into the UN in 1956. So all of these things are just, the backdrop of just before the Mysterians comes into the cinemas.
We might add one more bit of background here because of the output of Toho. Toho is one of the top studios, and they're really doing three different types of films in this period that we're discussing. One is the historical costume dramas, the Jiraigeki. The other is the monster and science fiction films. But the third is they're doing business films. They're doing films about, and I forget the name of the series, but they have a long series that focuses on successful businessmen and their assistants and how they're helping to transform modern Japan, make modern Japan. Because all of these are in some way a reminder that this is a culture in transition, and part of that transition is becoming tremendously economically successful, which helps give reason to what you see as part of the context of the Mysterians, and that is enormous scientific and technological development that can almost immediately, like turning on a dime, and produce technology that can combat these extraterrestrial invaders.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's talk about the Mysterians, because it's absolutely, and I know for people who are listening who weren't able to get a really nice copy, because there are a few kind of older copies that you can find in corners of the internet, getting a nice, beautiful, the color is amazing. So
Yes.
color films are not very common in Japan at this time. I think Toho have got a couple out in 56. So color is a big draw, and it's the first mecha-kaiju is another thing. Like there's quite a lot of stuff going on, which is Moguera, who apparently, Yuki, that means mole, but it looks like a big bird, huge robot. Who doesn't love a huge robot? And I love the fact that Honda has this kind of love of American science fiction. You can tell that comes through. But then it has such a heavy kind of Japanese cultural feel to it.
Let's add one more technological element here. This is a CinemaScope film.
Which they call Toho-scope,
This is
right?
Toho-scope,
Yeah.
but it's essentially the CinemaScope technology with the special CinemaScope lens, anamorphic lens. This film is beautifully shot for CinemaScope, and indeed, if you're going to have creatures and battling, it gives you stuff that you can fill. One of the great problems of CinemaScope is how do you fill that screen when, especially if you're a professional cinematographer for whom most of his thinking is centered on the very traditional 1.33 to 1 or 1.37 to 1 aspect ratio, you're given almost twice as much space, and they fill that space beautifully. Yeah. Now it has one narrative impact that we can see as we get into the Mysterians. You don't see nearly as much of a focus on close-ups or two shots where you just simply have two people talking, because we have to fill up all that space. We have so much negative space. But I think it's one of the testimonies to Honda, the director,
Absolutely.
and his cinematographer.
Jay, just a little bit more from you. You were saying that the numbers shocked me. There's a number of, how many ticket sales were there in the late 1950s?
I read one historian who said there were over 1 billion tickets sold in Japan during the 1950s. And that tells you about the role that movies were playing in that, as I said, the culture in transition. A lot of that transitional impact is going on or being played out in the movies, on the screens. I've always said that genre films are a kind of cultural problem-solving device. Genre stories, like science fiction stories, are stories that we tell as a culture in order to help us deal with the things that are bothering us at any one point. And that's why a particular genre will come and a particular genre will go. It will wax and it will wane in its popularity. But the Japanese culture is working a lot of these tensions and issues out on that big screen. Now, the strange thing, and again, she alluded to this, is that these films are also, even though they're working out a lot of Japanese cultural issues, they're also going to be popular throughout the world, and especially in the United States.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to say, when you told me that figure, I had to go and search for it online. So I went to the Japanese Motion Picture Producers Association of Japan, as I mentioned, and they have a list of the number of admissions in thousands. So from 1957, 58, 59, and 1960, there were over 1 billion ticket sales in each of those years. I just found that phenomenal. And then television comes in, and that starts to slowly go down. Yuki.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the film and how it begins with this very kind of traditional festival.
Right.
And then you think that there's some kind of natural disaster happening, and then the science and I suppose the science fiction comes in. So can you tell us a little bit about the kind of the things at play here?
Sure, sure. But first of all, Jay, thank you for the number, and Aisha as well,
Oh, it's Jay.
because I was shocked as well because in the 50s the entire population is still less than 100 million people living there in that archipelago, and over a billion tickets. That's really blew my mind. But I thought it was interesting. It's a science fiction film, but it opens up with very, very traditional folkloric dancing scene. And it shows kind of a community bonding and, community based society, still sort of traditional Japanese, but also science is something imported to Japan. Kind of people see it as Western technology, Western science, and so I think that kind of combination is fascinating. But at the same time, as I was talking about this pacifist claim, like for example, in comparison with Godzilla, I saw Godzilla as a movie that the producers and all people who are involved with this film were concerned about what they should think of science. What if a scientist invented something totally inhumane or horrific or almighty weapons? What's the responsibility of them? But it seems like that question has been all gone in the Mysterians. It's more like praising science, even though it was coupled with this traditional Japanese values like dancing scenes in the beginning. But I didn't see much tension when it comes to science, but more like what it means to be a pacifist. Because funny thing is, these invaders, they themselves claim that they are pacifists,
Mm,
right? But when they had to do something harm, they are not directly harming people on Earth, but rather they are causing some natural disaster and to have an upper hand or to defeat them. So that is an interesting claim that how can pacifists fight
mm.
or defend themselves? So that's the kind of tension I see, the shift of tension from Godzilla to the Mysterians.
And we have the same scientist that we had in Godzilla, but his
It
role is
is.
slightly different in this one. So it's he's called Shiraishi in this one, and he's a physicist. But when you're saying it's not a negative thing, he's shown as being kind of, even from the start, he's shown as slightly being an outsider, right? He's kind of like, oh well, I'm not going to get married, and I don't want, he's obsessed with his science before he disappears. So there is that kind of there is still a kind of a tension there, I think, between people enjoying the traditional festivities and this man who's like, no.
Right. Yeah, that
Right.
you're right. Because community is always like bonding, whereas he's refusing to be a part of it or community. And interestingly, an actor who played Shiraishi, who also played Serizawa in Godzilla,
Mm.
Right.
he was also an outsider, sort of loner, a lone wolf figure. So that's very interesting. Yeah.
When I see a film like this, and it's a film that I do love and loved even as a child, um, I always ask, why was this film made?
Mm.
Um, I think the nub of that issue, i- in part, arises from that notion of a of a society that is uh, pushing towards or trying to embrace a pacifist attitude. But then it plays out this amazing paradox
Mm.
that shows up in other films of the period. That is, you have it juxtaposing Earth's military might
Mm.
and the authoritarian elements implicit in that against this alien military might and the sort of fascist approach, give us your women, uh, we'll do with them what we want, uh,
Mm.
that's attached to it. And the film gets us to cheer for one sort of power, and I'll use this word fascism loosely here, uh, for one sort of fascism against another. You cheer for one, against the other, and that allows you to accept one, or at least its implications, and that includes, science and technology. These were things that were seemingly becoming more threatening to peace and prosperity, making any kind of pacifist attitude more difficult to embrace. But then, so the film is saying that is letting us deal with the threatening aspects of the former, of science and technology, and letting them therefore become acceptable as necessary defenses in an unknown world. So I see this as a film that allows us to, it's helping us to embrace science and technology in a period when moral certainty is disappearing, when religion, as we see in the festival at the beginning of the film, or the same festivals and the same religious elements that are in Godzilla, in a period when religion, democracy, political institutions are either crumbling or threatened, and the world is casting about for some sort of moral mooring, as I might put it, and you wind up with an us versus them narrative. Certainly, you want to embrace our technology, our science, our weaponry. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of the Mysterians, the mystery of what's out there. So it provides an almost unquestionable bit of necessary embrace here.
Totally, I totally agree. So one side, the Mysterian side, they are claiming pacifists, but they are causing harms in kind of indirect way, or direct way to kidnap women. But in terms of weapons or military might, they were not directly resorting to it. Whereas in Japan, supposedly pacifist country, they tried to fight against the Mysterians and using science. But ultimately, what they did was they resorted to the U.S. military power or U.S. technology, U.S. science. So kind of what it means to be a pacifist. You have to kind of ask for Big Brother's help, or you know what it means. So I think that tension was beautifully said by Jay. So I'm very pleased to hear that.
The cliche of coming to take our women. Now, when I was doing my research, I came across something which I should probably give a trigger warning for. But there was, once the soldiers, so the occupation is finished, but they're still occupying Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Is that right, Yuki? Yeah. And there was a lot of backlash. People did not want military bases there. There were, protests and everything. But two things. First of all, they set up the Recreation and Amusement Association, which was basically a government brothel. Is that right to say? Yeah. So the thought of coming to take our women, or women being accessible to an alien force, that could be an easy reading of that. And then even worse than that, there were two terrible rape incidents in Okinawa, which involved children. And there was a huge backlash to those. And that was in 1955. So these things must have been within the Japanese kind of consciousness when they're talking about aliens coming and taking our women. Yuki.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. To some extent, aliens come and kidnap women, meaning like this is not a politically appropriate way to say it, but taking properties from the community, right? Like women are often considered as properties. So taking properties, taking women is often kind of a universal theme. But as you said, it is so true. It was actually happening there. But when it comes to RAA,
Recreation and Amusement Association, yeah.
right. It's always the case. The community always preserve or protect their properties. But when it comes to women, they separate women who can be abandoned, or they can discard, or they can even offer to sacrifice, and women we needed to protect. And that is the same as comfort women. during the war, but also this institution as well after the war, because of those occupied soldiers. In order for our proper women to be protected, we needed to sacrifice, we need to offer different kind of women, right? So there is always good women to protect and bad women to offer. um, and I think that this case kidnapping works, it's because those are good women, one of us, and good women we needed to protect. So I think, however, Okinawa was not a part of Japan yet. I think it became a part of Japan in 1972. So it was a big issue, and still to this day, even though Okinawa is a part of Japan, it has been all over 50 years, 60 years. But still, those incidents, unfortunately, taking place in Okinawa. But mostly mainland people were not so keen to doing something, and partly because this kind of mindset that there are two kinds of people, two kinds of women. But yeah, those historical events definitely is a backdrop of this plot.
And at the same time, the aliens are also, they come with a story that they've come to Earth because radiation, and it's strontium-90, which has damaged their planet and their species. So that kind of then again makes it a bit more ambiguous, because that would suggest that, it's more aligned with the experience of Japan.
Yes. And I found it interesting because they, in order to restore their life or their lineage, they needed healthy women's blood. And then, in other words, there is no concern for unhealthy women, right? If there is male and female in an alien. So it's always kind of women's, even though those women who need to be protected, they are the ones who are considered as being taken, being used for men's healthy body. So that sort of ideas are fascinating to me still there.
Because you were saying that there's a kind of almost a dichotomy, as blood is both, what was it, pollution and vitality? Are they like the two different sides of it?
Right. For a long time, blood is considered as a pollution, and it still is. But I think it became very, and then the idea of blood being a source of vitality, which actually came from kind of a Christian idea, right? In Christianity, taking Christ's blood is an important ritual, and blood is good. Also, it represents the lineage. That idea became very um, intensified after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which is the regime change. The emperor became head of the head of state, and in order to legitimize his reign, people says, well, the emperor is a direct descendant of the goddess, and so therefore he has the purest blood in his body, which means there is always the sacred or the purest. There has to be
The
polluted.
opposite.
Yeah, exactly, the opposite. In the 50s, the obsession with blood is not just in Japan. In the US, because of the Korean War, the blood supply was on shortage. So actually, there was a policy that that people should the the government was trying to citizens to be a walking blood bank.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a tattoo that some people actually had a tattoo to put to inscribe what the blood type is, so that if something happens, maybe nuclear war took place or whatever the case, then people know what kind of blood type people carries. And often radiation induced illness is often associated with blood contamination. So the blood contamination is, so that's part of the reasons why people who are exposed to radiation has been faced discrimination even by the fellow Japanese citizens, because their blood is contaminated. So the aliens came to kidnap healthy women in order to draw out the pure uncontaminated blood into the contaminated blood. Is also, there is another layer of this blood metaphor in Japanese history.
Really interesting.
We might want to add an economic element here.
Mm.
Hmm.
And this is hardly surprising, but MGM would actually play up this the notion of "give us your women." One of their primary lines, and it's repeated in most of their um, posters and lobby cards. It was a see the daring attempt by love-starved men of another planet to steal our women. Um, and this is something that it's strangely characteristic of MGM, I think.
And of
Uh,
science fiction
of
generally.
science
Yeah.
fiction, yes, indeed. Archetypal image of 1950s US science fiction films with the robot carrying off or an alien carrying off
Mm.
the scantily clad woman. And that is the same image that shows up in well, not a robot in this case, but a Mysterian uh, carrying off a woman clad in a see through negligee or something. It's one of those images that never actually occurs in the film itself. And at the same time, MGM was marketing this film on that sexual basis. They had also made one of their big publicity deals with a children's soda, children's chocolate drink, so that they were selling it to kids and to their parents, but especially, I guess, to their dads.
And the motif that the enemy kidnapped our woman were heavily used during the war. I see some posters,
Yeah.
during the Pacific War.
But then the overall kind of message with all this kind of policy is one of peace and collaboration. Like it is very kind of Japan have joined the UN and we are ready to go forward.
Well, certainly there's this general optimism that you find in throughout the films that Ishiro Honda makes. Um, this as a global thinking, and I think that is important. Is looking outward and trying to remind everyone that we're a part of this world. Uh, and that's the point that's made over and over in this film. Um, it concerns all of mankind, one of the characters says. Another one says, let this be a lesson for the earth. Uh, and then another one, I think it's the professor who says, there is, after all, only one earth.
Mm.
So we have to take care of it. Uh, and so, this is a sort of message that shows up repeatedly in these the kaiju films. Uh, and it's one of the reasons why people, I think, enjoyed them and embraced them. Um, they ultimately say something very positive and hopeful, and
Mm.
in a period where there's enormous Cold War tension.
Right. And then the Mysterians are definitely a bad example, right? Like the scientist was saying, if mankind keeps doing this nuclear
Yes,
test, we will perish in 20 years or something along that line.
yes, right.
So definitely we have to do something with this scientific invention. So that's one. And it's interesting that message was, it seems to me very clear, but it was well received in terms of commercial success outside of Japan as well, and especially in the United States. The United States was the one who was keeping the test up to 1032 in the up to 90s. So that was interesting. And I think I totally agree with Jay in terms of global thinking. So on the one hand, very this concern of the one planet, one Earth, and the future of humankind, and but at the same time, kind of domestically, what can we do to protect ourselves? Can we resort to the U.S. military power under so nowadays we call it under the nuclear umbrella. We don't have nukes, but we are under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and that's how we protect ourselves. So is this the weapon to protect ourselves, or should we keep pacifist path? So that's the kind of message I got from this film.
Okay, great. Jay, you said that you saw the trailer for this film when you were a small child. Can you tell us a bit about your experience and also about how it was received in the US at that time?
Well, we know it was received very well.
Yes.
it repeatedly had a strong um, support, strong box office. This is a film that was mass marketed. It was what they called saturation marketed at that point, um, and it reached me. I was just a little to lot, very little to lot. It reached me because that saturation market was using television, and this is one of the big changes that you get starting around the mid 1950s, where television becomes not uh, so much not just a competitor to the movie industry, but it becomes one of the ways in which the movie industry is staying vital. Uh,
Mm.
there's so many of the movie studios in the U.S. were afraid of television. Uh, they didn't want to sell their product to television. They didn't want to let their actors go to television. Because their profits were dwindling. That's why, of course, we had things like CinemaScope and Technicolor and such being becoming more widespread, or 3D becoming widespread, because these are ways of keeping the cinema audience.
Mm.
But television now becomes an adjunct. Once they realize that you can reach many more people than you could with print advertising, or the person that MGM brings in as the head of marketing, and he had also handled the marketing campaign for Godzilla, by the way, which was not distributed by MGM, is Terry Turner. And Terry Turner says, well, I'm going to reach 137, this is a figure he quotes, 137 million readers. But they wound up reaching many more than that with television. And so this is a film that reaches out with its vibrant colors and its enormous amount of action, and its very imaginative uh, technologies. Like these special ray reflectors that are going to turn the Mysterians' rays back upon themselves and use their power to destroy themselves. That's an interesting sidelight
Mm.
political commentary, by
That
the
is.
way, that we could take up. Um, but all this, it spurs the imagination, especially of little tykes like myself back then. Um, but it also is very, very effective in approximately 100 theaters at once, just in New York City, or the New York metropolitan area, I should say. Uh,
Mm.
uh, it appears, and
And can I ask,
it
are these dubbed?
these are
That's probably how
dubbed.
they're going. Yeah, they're all dubbed.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. This is one of the another interesting sidelight, I suppose. We know that when Godzilla is brought to the United States, uh, there are all sorts of emendations made to it.
Mhm.
Uh, some things that they figure the U.S. population will not like, or might treat negatively, like the various ways in which the original Goira talks about World War II experience, about going back to the bomb shelters and scars and unexploded bombs. These things are all cited in the original Goira, and it gives it a greater cultural texture, which one of the things I love about that original print.
Mm.
But when it comes to the United States, they cut a lot of that stuff out, and they add in an American, or actually Canadian actor, Raymond Burr, to serve as a eyewitness to events, and that gives it a whole different flavor. It's a nice difference, but it's costly. Uh, there's nothing else done here except for dubbing this film.
Oh,
So
nice. Yeah.
MGM paid a lot of money for the rights, but they didn't have to do anything other than this one thing, and that is they do a dubbed version. There's very little footage difference between the American release and the Japanese release. I think it's less than 2 minutes. The reviewers tended to concentrate more on the visuals, which I think is
Which are
appropriate,
stunning. Yeah, it's
which are
such a
stunning.
beautiful film. Yeah, and such beautiful people, such beautiful outfit. Like everything's it's very beautiful film if you can get hold of it. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I was wondering about the alien outfits, because I saw it, and a listener mentioned, because they had watched the film as well. Hi, Hans. Um, that it reminded them of a cartoon that came to the well, Utah, and he's from the US, so it would have traveled, which is based on the Gatchaman comics, and it's the Battle of the Planets. And I'm wondering, because that look, the kind of the helmet and the cloaks and the bright colors are so, they're almost identical, but I couldn't really find any information about them being linked online anywhere or in my resources. Do you know anything about that?
Right. I think the listener is referring to Gatchaman, and that's probably much later. So what I hear is the Mysterians, that style, the outfit or costume, actually set the archetype for the
Mm.
later science fiction or tokusatsu special effect series,
Mm.
TVs. That's what I hear. They really set the model.
I just wanted to, because you mentioned Godzilla as well, and because I didn't mention the composer, and Yuki, I'm going to go to Akira Ifukube.
Mhm.
Is that
Yep.
right? Yeah.
Was it?
Amazing musical score, I think, in both of them. Very grand. Like the beginning of both of these films, when the music comes on, it is grand, it is overwhelming, it is
Yeah.
powerful. And he also invented the Godzilla roar.
Right.
So just a quick
Ah,
little shout out, because I think I didn't want to do the whole film, and like I did miss out in Godzilla and not mention him. So quick shout out there. And now,
wait a minute.
yes, please
We have
go
to
ahead.
do a shout out
Uh,
to, and this is amazing. We've been talking for an hour and we haven't mentioned the head of special effects, Tsuburaya. Uh,
right.
and I suppose we should give a small shout out to the fact that the two fellows who played in the Godzilla suit at various times in the original production, they also have to inhabit the Moguera suit in the Mysterians.
Right.
So this is one of the nice things about a studio like Toho. They have an enormous amount of talent, and they import that talent from one film to the next to the
Mm.
next to the next.
But not just that,
We
you've got films coming from Kurosawa and going to it's
Right.
interesting how they go all the way through to different genres and back and forth.
Takashi Shimura could play any role. But again, the people who doing the special effects work, Tsuburaya is a legend in Japan, and he was also someone who knew directing. He came to special effects work because he had been originally he was a second unit director, and he had actually worked with Joseph von Sternberg as his second unit director on the one film that von Sternberg made in Japan. So we have all this talent that is there, and just figure out how to best use it, and they use it well.
Right. And then just a trivia about Ifukube, the music composer. His older brother was somehow involved with some radiation experiment or a radiation lab, and so he passed away from radiation induced illness before the war ended. So I think it's interesting somehow he was involved with those kaiju movies, which is saturated in this radiation theme, and he is composing music for them.
Absolutely. Um, okay, so let's go on to the legacy of the film. Yuki, you can go first.
Oh, legacy. Well,
Yeah.
Gatchaman, the listener mentioned, that was very much appreciated. I didn't think of that, but since Jay was talking about special effect, I think those Toho movies very much influenced the later Tsuburaya's production and tokusatsu series, which is special effect series
Yeah,
on
so that's the
TV.
genre in a way, right? It's like a special
Yeah,
effects genre,
genre,
right? Yeah.
exactly. And
Mhm.
that started as movies, those Godzilla or the Mysterians, but as Jay laid out, those places, those venues shifted to TVs. And if this is a place that I make recommendations, I would recommend the Ultraman series, which also sees the recurrent themes like self defense, but also interestingly some kind of not always, but occasionally some sympathies toward the enemies, and that's also very interesting
Mm.
part, and partly because of the screenwriters were one of the screenwriters was originally from Okinawa, so he has some kind of outsider perspective, and the enemies who appears as enemies may not necessarily be villains. So that kind of message sometimes appears here and there in those tokusatsu series.
Interesting. Okay, Jay, so we'll wrap up legacy and recommendations together for you, please.
Okay, legacy. Well, we know the footage shows up in other Toho films. King Kong versus Godzilla, for example, is using some of the footage from the Mysterians. Moguera shows up in at least one other Toho film that I know of, Godzilla versus Space Godzilla. There's a sequel of sorts, The Battle in Outer Space. There is the homage that we have in American pop culture, thanks to one of the top rock bands of the 60s and 70s, Question Mark and the Mysterians. They love that film, so they took their name from it. Let me do some recommendations. So, I said one of my whys for why was this film even made? What is it all about? I push that notion of the them versus us, and how this film therefore gets us to take sides. And there's one really nice book that's entitled Them or Us. I'm sorry, Them or Us, by a fellow named Patrick Lucanio, where he covers the enormous range of science fiction films in the 1950s and 1960s and slightly beyond, that are all about the aliens and what they're coming to do to us, and the attitudes that they evoke. And he does a Jungian reading. We don't think much about Jungian psychology, but I think that's an interesting take on this, because it tells us that as much as we've been emphasizing the cultural, there's something even deeper here at work. Things in the earth, coming out of the earth, the burrowing of Moguera, for example. That's something almost archetypal. And Lucanio's book tries to hit upon the archetypal element that is not just about a culture, but about all of human culture that's being embodied in films like The Mysterians. And also, maybe just by way of a visual, another Toho film, Invasion of Astro Monster, from 1965. It's similar in many ways, but what it adds in several kaiju, including one of the first revised visions of Godzilla. So Godzilla looks friendlier and is playing a friendlier creature to help Earth. And they also trot in an American actor, not after the fact, but actually in the making of the film. So you get that sense of cultural cohesion between Japan and the U.S.
Thank you so much, both of you, for coming on the show.
Thank you, and I appreciate being invited once again.
Great. That's it for this episode. Next episode, we will be travelling to 1958, Czechoslovakia, to look at one of the greatest Czech films of all time. Known as The Fabulous World of Jules Verne outside of Czechoslovakia, and also translated as Invention for Destruction. The film is by Karel Zeman, and you can try and find it on a few places, which I'll leave in the show notes. The other thing I wanted to talk about was advertising and subscriptions. Advertising will be introduced to the podcast very soon, and I will be introducing some subscription options for those who want to support the show. I am truly flabbergasted with the amount of support this podcast has received, and I am so grateful. I really, really do appreciate it that people are spending time investing and listening to the podcast, which is an absolute joy for me, and I love hearing from you. So thank you so much for that. You can check out more information about that as I go along in the show notes for the podcast, but also on Threads and Instagram and a little bit on Blue Sky. So keep an ear out for that, or an eye out. And lastly, as always, if you can leave a rating or review, it really helps the show. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.